good evening and welcome. Settle into whatever position feels kindest to your body tonight, and let the day loosen its grip a little, shoulders soft, jaw unclenched, hands resting where they want to rest. You don't need to solve anything right now, or replay anything, or plan ahead. For a little while, you can simply listen and drift, as if the night itself has decided to carry you. If it helps, imagine the air is cool and clean, and every breath is a quiet invitation to slow down. Let's take a gentle walk to a place where the sky feels close and time moves at the pace of stars. The road to the hill is narrow and familiar, the sort of road that doesn't hurry you because it knows there's nowhere urgent to be at this hour. Summer has kept its promise of clarity. The last warmth of the day still lingers in the soil, but the air has turned cool enough to feel like a clean sheet pulled across your shoulders. The observatory sits above the sleeping town like a patient thought, a pale dome against a darker slope, its windows dark, its doors closed, its presence steady. As the observer approaches, footsteps make the smallest sound on gravel, and then even that fades, swallowed by the broad quiet that gathers where streetlights don't reach. At the gate, the observer pauses out of habit and affection, palm resting on the metal latch, as if greeting an old friend. The metal is cool, decisively cool, and it pulls a little heat from the skin, a tiny reminder that night has its own temperature and its own rules. Beyond the gate, grass leans in gentle clumps along the path, and a few insects keep up their steady, drowsy music as if turning pages in the dark. Somewhere far below, a late train passes with a soft, drawn-out hush, not loud enough to interrupt the silence, only enough to underline it. The door of the observatory opens with a careful, well-oiled sound, a small sigh that feels like permission. Inside, the air holds traces of dust and clean metal, and something faintly like old paper, the comforting scent of rooms where people have spent long hours paying attention. The observer steps in and closes the door, letting the outside world remain outside, as if it can wait on the doorstep until morning. There is no need to turn on the big lights. A small lamp with a warm, low glow is enough, just bright enough to keep corners gentle and shadows unthreatening. The building feels hollow in the best way, quiet, sheltered, designed for listening to distant things. up the narrow stairs. Each step is measured, not because of caution, but because the body naturally adjusts to the calm. The dome room waits at the top, round and orderly, with the telescope standing like a tall, patient instrument that has learned the discipline of stillness. The observer walks around it slowly, fingertips brushing a rail, then the mount, then the smooth tube, acknowledging the familiar surfaces. Even in summer, the telescope's skin is cold, metal that has spent hours facing open sky, and the chill sinks into the fingertips in a way that feels oddly grounding, like holding a cool stone by a river. The observer breathes out, and in the exhale, there is the sense of arriving. A few practical rituals follow, quiet and unhurried. A notebook is placed on the work table. Opened to a fresh page, a pencil is set across it so it won't roll. A small red light is switched on dim enough to protect night vision, bright enough to make the page legible, and the room becomes a careful blend of shadow and faint ruby glow. The observer checks the power, the alignment marks, the clamps, the slow motion controls, each touch light but certain. Nothing is rushed, because nothing is chasing them. The sky will not run away, and the stars will keep their appointments. The dome slit is still closed, and before opening it, the observer stands for a moment with one hand on the wheel, listening. The building is full of tiny sounds when you give it the chance. The soft settling of wood, the almost inaudible click of cooling metal, the faint movement of air through vents. Outside, a night bird calls once, then falls silent, as if remembering that silence is part of the arrangement. The observer turns the wheel, and the shutter begins to move with a low, steady rumble that feels like distant thunder that has decided to behave. A wedge of night appears, deep and clear, and the first stars are suddenly present, not as an idea, but as bright points that seem close enough to touch. It always feels like this here, as if the sky has lowered itself toward the hill out of curiosity. The observer steps closer to the opening and looks up, letting the eyes adapt, letting the mind stop naming things for a moment. Darkness is not empty. It is layered, textured, filled with subtle differences. Ink black here, velvety there, and in the middle, a faint smear of the Milky Way like breath on glass. The air slips in through the slit, cool against the face, carrying the scent of grass and stone and the last trace of daytime warmth. A breeze moves over the dome and around it, and the building answers with a soft creak, as if nodding. The observer returns to the telescope and begins the first alignment, a process so familiar it feels like a slow dance. Hands find the knobs without searching. The mount turns with a smooth resistance, like a well-made door. The eyepiece is cool when the observer leans in, and the cold edge against the brow is a small shock that sharpens attention without breaking the calm. One bright star is chosen as a starting point, then another, and the telescope learns where it is by learning where they are, as if mapping its own posture against the sky. The observer murmurs nothing, because the silence is doing its job. But inside, there is a quiet satisfaction as the instrument settles into precision. With the basics set, the observer allows a small indulgence, a long look without writing, without checking, simply looking. The field of view fills with faint points, some sharp, some trembling gently as the air shifts, each one steady in its own patience. It's strange, the observer thinks, how a thing so far away can feel so intimate when framed by a circle of glass. The mind begins to slow into the rhythm of observation. Look, breathe, adjust, look again. And the rest of life recedes like a town scene from the far side of a lake. Somewhere below, a dog barks once, perhaps answering a dream, and then the night folds back into itself. The first constellation the observer finds is one that always feels like a greeting, easy to recognize even when the mind is tired. The telescope is nudged, the finder scope checked, and there it is, a familiar arrangement of points that has been named and renamed by countless people who wanted to make pictures out of light. The observer doesn't cling to the names too tightly. Tonight, the pattern can be a hunter, a harp, a wing, or simply a pleasing geometry. In the notebook, the observer writes the date, the time, the clarity of the sky, the softness of the seeing, the gentle coolness that has settled in the room. The pencil makes a faint scratch that feels almost like a lullaby in this quiet place. A second constellation follows, and then a third, the observer moving from one to the next with the calm confidence of someone strolling through a familiar garden at night. The dome opening frames a section of sky, and the observer rotates the dome with slow, deliberate effort so the slit keeps pace. The wheel's motion is a steady whisper of mechanics, not loud, just present enough to remind the body that this is a crafted place, made by hands that cared. Each time the dome shifts, a different portion of darkness slides into view, and the stars appear to rearrange themselves, not because they move much in a moment, but because the observer's window onto them has changed. It feels a little like turning a page in a very old book. Sometimes the observer steps away from the eyepiece and looks up with naked eyes, letting the whole sky return. Without the telescope, the stars are simpler, bright points scattered like salt. But the simplicity has its own comfort. The observer leans lightly against the wall, feeling the dome's coolness through the shirt, and listens again. Far away, on a road that can't be seen, a car passes, its sound a soft thread that pulls and then breaks. In the grass outside, an insect starts and stops its song, as if testing the night and deciding it is safe. Above, the Milky Way stretches like a pale path, and the observer imagines that if you walked it slowly enough, you could find all the quiet thoughts you ever misplaced. When the observer returns to the telescope, the next target is chosen with care. Not every object is right for a bedtime mind. Some things invite too much thinking, too much counting, too much urgency. Tonight, the observer wants objects that feel like exhalations, open clusters that scatter like handfuls of diamonds, a soft nebula that looks like a smudge of lantern light, a galaxy that shows itself as a delicate blur, humble and distant. The telescope moves with a gentle hum from its drive, and the observer's hand rests on the tube for a moment, feeling the faint vibration, a pulse that says the instrument is awake. The metal is still cold, and the observer lets that coldness anchor attention, the way cool water anchors a warm hand. A small cluster appears in the eyepiece, and it looks like a tiny spill of brightness on velvet. The observer adjusts focus in small increments. Turn, pause, breathe, turn, and the points sharpen until they seem to snap into place, crisp and clean. It's always satisfying, that moment when the sky cooperates and the optics agree. when the object turns from suggestion into presence. The observer writes a few lines. The cluster's name, the approximate brightness, the impression it gives, the way the stars seem to gather more tightly at the center. Then, because the night is for gentleness, the observer adds something less technical. Feels like a handful of cool sparks held in a careful palm. The act of note-taking is soothing in its own way, like knitting or stacking smooth stones. Each line on the page is proof that the observer was here, awake and attentive, and that the night offered something worth recording. The red light keeps everything intimate. It doesn't flood the room. It simply makes a small island of visibility, and beyond it, the dome is mostly shadow. The observer's breath is steady, and the observer becomes aware of how the cool air tastes, clean, slightly mineral, with a hint of grass. The silence doesn't feel lonely. It feels companionable, as if the building itself is keeping watch too. Outside the slit, the sky seems unusually close tonight, as if it has leaned down to see what the observer is doing. There are nights when the stars feel like distant decoration, and there are nights like this one, when each bright point looks sharp enough to be a pinprick in a vast, dark fabric. The observer feels a gentle awe that doesn't demand anything. It simply expands the chest a little, loosens the mind, makes personal worries seem smaller without dismissing them. The hilltop location helps less haze, fewer lights, and the clarity has a kind of kindness to it. The observer thinks of all the people sleeping below, their windows dark, their dreams private, and feels quietly grateful to be awake on their behalf, keeping a small vigil with glass and metal. The telescope turns toward a nebula that has always reminded the observer of breath in winter air. At first, it's barely there, a faint clouding against the black, but with averted vision and patient looking, it becomes more distinct, like a secret that reveals itself only to calm attention. The observer adjusts the eyepiece and lets the eye relax rather than strain, and the nebula responds by becoming softer and larger, an object that can't be forced. In the notebook, the observer sketches a small shape, not precise, just enough to remember the feeling of it. The observer writes, not a thing to capture, more like a place to visit. As the hours move, the dome room cools further, and the observer notices the sensation of cold metal more often. on the adjustment knobs, on the ladder rail, on the edge of the eyepiece. Each touch is a small, waking reminder, but not an unpleasant one. The observer has learned to appreciate the honesty of it. Metal does not pretend to be warm when it is. The observer pulls a light jacket closer, the fabric whispering softly, and returns to the eyepiece. Somewhere outside, leaves shift, and the sound is like water moving over stones, slow and irregular. A faint satellite crosses the opening of the dome, moving steadily among the stars, and the observer watches it for a moment with quiet curiosity. There is something comforting about its untroubled motion, its simple certainty, a human-made dot gliding through an ancient scene. The observer imagines, briefly, the people who built it and the people who track it, and then lets the thought drift away like mist. The night is not asking for analysis. It's offering presence. The observer goes back to constellations, letting the familiar patterns act like stepping stones across the sky. One of the constellations sits low, closer to the horizon, and it looks different from the hill than it does from the town. The air near the horizon is thicker. The stars there slightly softened, and the observer enjoys the contrast. Sharp points overhead, gentle blurring below, a natural gradient of clarity. The telescope finds the pattern easily, and the observer notes how the lower stars seem to wink more, shimmering faintly with the atmosphere's slow currents. The observer's pencil moves again, recording not just the object, but the mood of looking at it. It's a quiet kind of artistry, capturing impressions rather than making something new. The observer takes a break for water, moving slowly so the body doesn't startle itself awake too sharply. The cup is cool in the hand, and the water tastes clean. And for a moment, the observer stands again at the dome opening and simply listens. A far-off owl calls, a sound that doesn't feel ominous, only thoughtful, like a question asked gently into the dark. From even farther away comes a faint, steady hum that could be a highway or a river or the world's own low note. The observer lets the sounds pass through without grabbing them, the way you let thoughts pass through when you're trying to fall asleep. Back at the telescope, the observer decides to visit a galaxy, not because it will look dramatic. Most galaxies in a modest telescope do not, but because the idea of it is soothing. The telescope points, the finder scope aligns, and the observer looks. At first, there is nothing but starfield, and then, slowly, the faintest oval glow emerges, like a breath held at the edge of sight. It doesn't shout, it barely speaks. The observer feels a tender amazement at the thought that this faint blur is a city of stars. Light that began its journey long before this hill had a road, long before this dome existed, long before the observer's own name could have been imagined. The observer writes carefully, more slowly now, as if the pencil has become heavier. Galaxy visible as pale oval, brighter core. Requires patience. Then, after a pause, another line appears. Feels like looking into a quiet distance inside myself. The observer doesn't usually write sentences like that in an observing log, but tonight the night has made room for it. The page accepts it without judgment, and the red light makes the graphite shine faintly. The observer closes the notebook for a moment and rests a hand on it, as if to keep the words from floating away. The sky continues its slow turning, and the dome must be rotated again. The observer puts both hands on the wheel and leans into the movement, feeling the resistance, and then the smooth glide as the dome responds. The sound is soft and mechanical, a steady rolling whisper that fades as soon as the motion stops. When the slit lines up again, a new portion of sky appears, and there is a small, childlike pleasure in that reveal. It is as if the night is offering a fresh scene, and the observer is allowed to be surprised even after years of looking. Now the observer chooses something simple and bright. A double star, 2 points close together. A small demonstration of how the universe can arrange beauty with minimal effort. The telescope finds it easily, and in focus, the pair looks like 2 tiny lamps hung side by side, one slightly warmer in tone, the other cooler. The observer adjusts magnification, watching the pair separate more distinctly, and feels the quiet satisfaction of clarity. The observer notes the colors, the separation, the steadiness of the atmosphere, and then sits back, letting the image linger in the mind like a pleasant chord. Even without music, the night is full of harmonies. Time becomes less linear in the dome. Minutes stretch and soften, then compress when the observer is absorbed. The observer's body grows heavier in a pleasant way. as if the quiet has weight and is resting on the shoulders like a blanket. The observer doesn't fight sleepiness. Sleepiness is welcome here, part of the night's design. Still, there is one more ritual. Checking a familiar star field, confirming the telescope's alignment hasn't drifted, making sure the night's notes are complete enough to feel satisfying later. The observer moves with the calm competence of someone turning down lamps in a house before bed. At one point, the observer steps outside the dome room onto a small platform that wraps around the observatory. The air out here is even cooler, and it touches the cheeks with gentle insistence. The hill falls away in darkness, and the town below is a sparse scattering of lights, as if someone set down a handful of embers and then left them to glow. Above, the sky is vast, and the stars seem to press closer without the dome's frame, filling the observer's vision until there is nowhere else to look. The observer rests both hands on the railing. The metal is cold and reassuring, a solid line between the body and the open night. From this vantage, distant sounds arrive in softened form. A late motorbike far away, muffled the whisper of wind through grass, a faint, rhythmic chirp. Nothing demands attention. The observer breathes in slowly, and the breath feels like a small mirror to the sky's steadiness. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. The observer thinks of the telescope inside, waiting patiently like a pet that doesn't mind being left alone for a moment. The observer thinks of the notebook, the pencil marks, the way the night has been collected not in trophies, but in gentle impressions. And then the observer simply stands, letting awe be quiet rather than loud. When the observer returns inside, the red light feels warmer than before, like a small hearth. The telescope stands ready, and the observer decides to end with a familiar constellation that rises higher now, a pattern that has always felt like a calm companion. The telescope swings into position. The observer looks, and there it is, a few bright stars making a shape that the mind can hold onto easily. The observer traces it silently, not with a finger, but with attention, connecting points with invisible lines. It's a child's habit and a scientist's habit at once, and it doesn't need justification. The observer writes the final notes of the session. Sky clear, seeing steady. temperature cool. Then one last line written smaller, as if not to disturb the quiet. Felt close to the sky tonight. The notebook is closed gently, the pencil placed on top, and the red light dimmed further. The observer spends a moment doing the practical closing tasks, capping the eyepiece, securing the telescope, checking the mounts, each action a soft goodbye. The dome slit is closed slowly, the night narrowing to a line, and then disappearing behind the shutter, not gone, only politely hidden until the next opening. The sound of the shutter settling is final in a soothing way, like a book closing at the end of a chapter you enjoyed. In the darkened room, with the sky now out of sight, the observer notices how the silence changes. It becomes more interior, less expansive, like quiet inside a shell. The observer stands still and lets that quiet wrap around the body. The day's thoughts try once or twice to return, small reminders, unfinished errands, but they drift off again when they meet the cool calm of this place. The observer's hands still remember the cold metal, the exact resistance of knobs and wheels, the fine control required to center a star. Those sensations remain like gentle fingerprints on the mind. Down the stairs, the observer moves with the care of someone already half asleep, though the eyes remain clear. The little lamp is turned off, and darkness becomes complete for a moment. But the observer isn't afraid of it. It feels soft and thick, like velvet. The door opens, and outside the night has continued without interruption. The summer sky still bright with stars. The observer steps onto the path and closes the door quietly, and the observatory returns to its patient stillness. A pale dome on a hill keeping secrets of light. As the observer walks back toward the gate, the gravel crunches softly, and then the sound stops with each pause of the foot. The observer looks up once more, not searching for anything now, simply letting the stars be what they are. There is a subtle sense of having been in conversation with the sky, a conversation made of looking and listening rather than words. The observer's shoulders feel looser, the mind less crowded. The night has done its work gently, without spectacle, like cool water calming warm skin. At the gate, the observer places a hand on the latch again. The metal is still cool, and the coolness feels like a seal on the evening's experience. A final, grounding touch. Beyond the gate, the road waits, quiet and safe, and the town below continues to sleep in its scattered pockets of light. The observer walks on, steps unhurried, and the sounds of the hill accompany the way: wind, insects, distant hush, each one a small proof that the world can be alive without being loud. Above, the stars keep their slow turning, indifferent and generous at once. And if you imagine this observer as you listen, perhaps you can borrow their calm for yourself. You don't have to hold the entire sky in your mind. You only have to notice a small piece of it, the way you only have to notice one breath at a time. The night can be a dome over you too, and your thoughts can be like constellations, present but not demanding, patterns you can look at without needing to chase them. Let your mind cool like metal under clear air, settling into stillness. Let the silence be kind, and let sleep arrive in its own steady orbit, as natural and unforced as the turning of the stars.